My name is Tom Speaks with the Impact Group, and this is Phil Herman.
Good morning, everyone. As Tom said, Phil Herman. I'm a partner at the Impact Group as well. We're going to go ahead and jump right in this morning. And of course, we're going to begin with a story. We're jumping all the way back to January 13th, 1982. And on January 13th, 1982, some of you will actually remember this. Air Florida Flight 90 was taking off from Washington International Airport in a snowstorm. And it turned out it had very significant icing on the wings, but they didn't know that when it was taking off. And almost immediately after takeoff, the plane began to lose altitude, and it crashed into the Interstate 395 bridge and then fell into the Potomac River. And there were so many ice flows that were coming down the river. The plane was in the actual river. Rescue workers were having a hard time getting to the plane, so they were using helicopters to dangle lines and try and grab survivors. They could grab onto the line and pull them to the shore. And one of those survivors was Priscilla Tirado. And she was too weak to hang onto the line. She grabbed hold of the line, but she couldn't hang on to it, and she fell into the river. And it turns out there were many bystanders that came to the crash site when they heard that crash, and they were standing along the side. And one of them was named Lenny Skutnik. And Lenny Skutnik was a worker in the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, and he was one of the bystanders that saw Priscilla Tirado fall into the water, and he immediately dove into the river and literally swam between ice floes to get to Priscilla Tirado and drug her to the shore and save her life. He pulled her through the water to the shore. And it was just a couple weeks later that President Reagan was giving the State of the Union address. And in that State of the Union address, Lenny Skutnik and his wife were seated next to First Lady Nancy Reagan, and President Reagan recognized Lenny Skutnik. He told his story, he told what happened, and he recognized him as a symbol of American heroism. And you see, President Reagan understood the power of stories. And he was one of the first presidents to use the power of story in that way. Really, he was trying to demonstrate to all Americans the importance of American heroism. And he used that as a theme throughout his presidency, but particularly in that State of the Union address. And see, he understood that there is tremendous power in using stories to make personal connections and to make a lasting impact. And even to this day, you don't watch a State of the Union address without seeing a president representing a policy or program and using citizens sitting in the gallery to demonstrate how that policy or program has an impact on their particular lives. And those people still today are called Skutniks after Lenny Skutnik. So they're like, who are your Skutniks that are going to be at the State of the Union address? And so today we're going to be exploring how you can use stories in your role as leaders also to make a personal connection and leave a lasting impact.
So the idea that the power of story is really the power of communication. I see a lot of communication experts on this call. The idea we believe to create a high impact organization, you have to have three things. You got to have communication. If people don't know what you're doing, if they don't have some understanding of what you're doing and have value in that, then you're in trouble. So how are you communicating the good things you're doing? The second thing you have to have is a great culture. Sometimes people think culture is like this foo-foo thing on the side. If your culture is off, communication suffers, things don't work. You have to have a great culture. And the third piece is a strategic plan. You got to know where you're going. When you know where you're going, clear strategic plan, clear idea that everybody's aligned, clear communication strategies, and then a positive culture. Those three elements, when they come together, you create a high impact organization. And that's what we do. Today, we're specifically talking about communication and the power of stories to drive communication.
So, what are we going to cover today? First of all, why are stories powerful? Secondly, how to use stories. And three, how to effectively communicate a story. What are some strategies to really get your stories out on a broad scale? So, Tom, let's begin with why are stories so powerful?
Why are stories so powerful? I want you to think arguably one of the best movies of all time, Shawshank Redemption. Shawshank Redemption, it's almost near the end of the movie, and Andy Dufresne, his spirit is almost crushed, and he's speaking with Red. And what he's talking about is hope. But he doesn't talk about hope, he talks about San Juantaneo, Mexico. And he has a vision of someday being on a beach and having an old charter boat that he's going to take his guests charter fishing and the blue waters. This is he once again, he's it's all about hope. It's about redemption. But he doesn't talk about hope and redemption. He creates this very vivid story which draws us in. As human beings, we're drawn into stories. It's that emotional connection. That's why it's so important. Phil, you want to talk about the science behind that a little bit?
Sure. And as you think back, we are wired as human beings to learn through stories. As a matter of fact, for thousands and thousands of years, that was the primary method of teaching youth is through stories. And you can go back in history. It was actually after the Industrial Revolution that more of our education model became about delivering content and less utilization of stories. But if you think back to the most effective teachers, coaches, individuals, people that have had a profound impact on your life, it's almost always individuals that were effective at telling stories to drive home a point. We are primed as human beings to learn through story. And there are things that happen in our brain when we hear stories. First of all, if we hear something that is a suspenseful statement or a plot twist, our brains release dopamine in that moment. Dopamine is a hormone that provides focus, memory, and motivation. And so, again, our brains are wired when they hear certain pieces of a story, when they hear something suspenseful, they are now actually releasing chemicals that help us remember. When we hear something about that is a danger or intensity, and we hear something really scary, our brains release cortisol. That's the stress hormone. It's telling our bodies, listen up, there's something to be learned here. And again, when you're telling stories, you have to be careful telling things that are too suspenseful because you can also actually block your audience from hearing the main point. But having some element of danger or intensity in a story primes again the brain to be learning. When we are vulnerable in telling a story to an audience, uh, our audience's brains actually release oxytocin. That's the same chemical that floods a mother's body after giving birth. It evokes empathy and connection. And it happens when we're hearing stories where someone is emotional with us or vulnerable with us. And lastly, when we hear things that are funny in stories, our brains release endorphins. Those are the same hormones that are released when we're exercising or when we're laughing. And again, they actually, those endorphins help us build connection when with a person that is telling the story. So it's really important for us to recognize that as human beings, we are primed to learn through stories. We're primed to connect through stories. As a matter of fact, there are chemical reactions that are happening in our brain when we are hearing stories that cause that to happen.
So what we're trying to do here is you're like, well, that's cool, Tom and Phil. Why are we talking about this? Well, because we're trying to talk about strategies to actually people actually connect, right? There's something called rational ignorance, where we are so bombarded with information, we actually rationally keep it out. We can't, all these advertisements, the rest, we can't absorb it all. So we really filter. A story is a way to really get in there. I mean, guys, people on this call, you're communicating 5-year budget projections and your this master facility plans. This stuff is dry as toast, right? So how do we get people to engage with this, to be aware? It's stories. I want another story, Good Will Hunting, another classic movie. If you remember, Goodwill, Will is on the park bench with Robin Williams. That's one of the scenes. Actually, let me take you the scene before that. When they're actually in the Robin Williams office, and Robin Williams is trying to teach Will about vulnerability and risk, and he's mentioning the time that when Robin Williams met his wife. He missed the best baseball game in the history of baseball games. He stayed at the bar where his wife was because he saw that she was there, and by gosh, he wanted to do. Through the power of story, he was able to connect, connection, vulnerability. These are the pieces he was trying to get, and Will was able to take that on. So it's interesting. Phil is going to talk about there's a model of a story that it's like ingrained in us as human beings. So the Good Will Hunting uses that same model. Phil, want to tell us a little bit about the model of how stories are developed?
Sure. Tom and I are both big fans of the book, Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller, and he does a great job of explaining the model in this book. But as we think about it, whether it's Good Will Hunting or another one of your favorite movies, I want you to think about this line that is consistent in any good story. And once we share this with you, you'll begin to see this unfold over and over and over and over again. This model, it's very effective. So first of all, there's a character who ends up being the hero, the character that has a problem, who meets a guide, who gives them a plan, who calls them to action, and that helps them avoid failure, and it ends in success. You have seen that line over and over and over again. If you think of your favorite movies, and again, I'll go through it again. There's a character who has a problem, who meets a guide, who gives them a plan, that calls them to action, that helps them avoid failure, and it ends in success. And if you begin to think about some of your favorite movies, you can think about who take on those different roles, and does it always consistently follow that role? As we think about telling stories, it's really important for us to understand that the most effective stories, particularly for school districts or boards of DD or cities or villages or parks, as leaders in those organizations, you might begin to think about, well, what role do I play or in that story? What role do we play as leaders? Or when we're telling that story on behalf of a district or a board of DD, who's the hero? And let me tell you, the hero are the people that you serve. Those are the heroes in our story. This is really important in terms of how we communicate. The heroes are not the superintendent. They are not the building administrators. Of course, in many ways, they are heroes to us, but for the purposes of telling this story, that's not who the heroes are. The heroes are those that you serve. And so we think about that through that line of thinking and tie it to movies. You, as leaders, are not Luke, you're Yoda. You're not Andy Dufresne. You're Red. You're not Shrek. You're the donkey, right? You're not Anna. You're Olaf. You are the guide that is giving them a plan that is helping them achieve wonderful things. And these stories of heroes who are accomplishing amazing things every single day within your organization are unfolding all the time. And we can tell that story. How is your organization helping them conquer a problem by being a guide that is calling them to action to achieve more than what they thought they could become alone without you? That is happening all the time within your organizations. So I want you to think about this for a minute. What are the problems? I want you to put these in the chat. Go ahead and open the chat for a second. What are the problems that your heroes are trying to overcome? Go ahead and put some of those in the chat.
Teacher retention.
Teacher retention. Yeah. Yeah. Um, so in that particular and mental health challenges for our students, the
Political
political environment. So again, those are your staff members or your students trying to overcome those challenges. Financial struggles.
burnout.
Yeah, burnout. And then as we think about that, so how can you as a leader and how can your organization be a guide to help overcome those? And how can you tell those stories? How are you helping your students overcome attendance challenges? What are you doing? And then ultimately, where are your stories of success? Where have you, who are your examples of success that you want your community to understand? Reduce student opportunities, access to recreation, So there are limited opportunities for access to recreation. That's a great example. Then how is your organization and how are you as leaders the guide that shares with them a plan so that they can access recreation? Now they become the hero in solving their own problem, accessing recreation in that particular case, or attending school in a particular case. And then what does success look like for them? And who are your examples of success? I would encourage you to think about who are the heroes? What are the problems? How are you the guide? What plan are you giving them? And then how are you helping them avoid failure and find success? And tell those stories because you have those examples again over and over and over in your organization.
You know what's interesting about some of this? I think Phil and I will say all the time that things may be common sense, but they're not common practice. In that, I think a lot of you are like, yeah, that's nothing new. That's true. Now you've got before you, I need to communicate our 5-year budget forecast. I need to communicate the fact that we are building a wing on a what? Okay, and let's face it, most of the time we start talking about we're building the wing or we're doing this or that. We got to step back and think about the emotional. One of the things that school districts, boards of DD, parks, the rest of you guys have that is a wonderful, you actually have built-in stories. If you're a company that sells telecommunications equipment, that's hard. That's hard to make that. But you guys have kids that are doing amazing things. You guys have teachers that are making breakthroughs. The people with developmental disabilities that are doing cool things. Those are awesome stories. And we have to really, again, the 5-year budget forecast, that is just an element of how are we doing these other things. So think about that. Think of the challenge and the rest. Okay, so the idea is we have our story there. I want us to think of that's a way to frame it. I also want to think of another way to use stories, which is kind of a coping mechanism, which is fascinating. But things are going to happen to you. I don't know if you've noticed that in this world. You really can't control things that happen. You've got a lot of control over what your perceptions are, your thoughts, your actions. You can control that. I want you all to think about this. I'm not talking about tragic things, but I'm talking about just plain kind of a rotten day or whatever. Aren't some of your very best stories situations that didn't go well? Honestly, I always tell the story. My uncle, it's a Speaks family legend. My uncle was very excited about a date, walked up to a door, pushed the doorbell, a bird pooped in his hair, and the door opened. He was very embarrassed at the time. We've been laughing about that for 40 years, right? I mean just those things that don't go well a lot of times are funny. I have a nephew who's a comedian and he's super funny. And he has this comedian's approach which I love. When things don't go well, he is hardwired to say, "Awesome, that is going to make a great joke. That is going to make a great story. It's a fast. I'm not, and once again, I'm not talking about tragic. I'm talking about just stuff that happens. If you can begin to reframe your mind using stories to kind of re-see some of these things, because later on, honest to gosh, they're funny. In the moment they're not, but later on they're funny. So just the ability to use story to frame how you're doing, but also as far as personal health and personal things, man, does it make something that might be kind of tough and it's something that's a little easier to take on board?
It's a great point what Tom's bringing up. Really, as leaders, when you're going through something really, really difficult, a difficult situation in your organization, we would actually encourage you to write down the elements of what is happening as if it were a chapter in a story. Maybe not with that level of detail, but write down the elements of what is happening. Look at it from the outside as if it is a chapter and there is something yet to unfold. What is the next chapter that is going to unfold? And again, going back to that framework, then how can who are the heroes in that? How can you find a way to make those that you serve the hero and to make your actions as a leader the guide that helps them through this particular challenge. Because many times we put ourselves in the center of our story. That's another really natural human thing. We put ourselves in the center of our story. But when you write it down and look at it objectively from the outside, it helps you take yourself out of the center of the story and put those that we're serving in the center of the story and have us come along by the side as a guide. And it also helps reframe our mind about potential solutions. And so stories are extremely powerful when we communicate them and we tell them about tell others what's going on within our organization. But they can also be really powerful in our own minds. And that's one way to navigate a challenge or use a story to help navigate a challenge. What is going to be the next chapter? And some of you might be thinking, well, that's what's giving me angst because I don't know what's going to be the next chapter. But it can provide that same framework for you to think about it a little bit differently, a little more objectively than when we're in the middle of it.
It's going to be fun. I challenge you guys. Next time you guys watch a movie or see something, I promise you're going to be like, there's the hero, there's the guide, there's the challenge. It's almost funny. I'm telling you, that's from King Arthur to Harry Potter to it's all the same story. It's just redone again and again and again. But that's just so wired into us. Okay, so let's talk about this. So if that's how to use a story, how do we communicate a story? First, I want to get across an idea about this, in that we're selling, not in a bad way. We're trying to communicate something to our targeted audiences, right? And understand when you're doing that, what you're selling. Think of Swiss Miss hot chocolate. When they're selling Swiss Miss hot chocolate, if you ever watched, they're not selling hot chocolate. They're selling a special moment with your granddaughter or with your mom, or it's that connection. That's what they're selling, right? So I want you to think about, when again, this common sense, everybody does this. It's not a common practice, man. If you're selling a building, you're not selling brick and mortar, man. You're selling the engagement that those students are going to have, the safe environment that your staff is going to have. If you're doing a budget plan, you're not selling a budget, you're selling the tools and resources that your kids need to do whatever. So I want us to think about, when we get into the core of what we need, to take a step back and to think about, if we delivered this well, which we will, what are the positive benefits that people are going to drive? Again, like if you're selling Hawaii trips, you don't sell the ticket. Here's your ticket to Hawaii. You don't want to see the ticket. I want to see a chair on the beach. That's it's the end result that you're going for. So just think of that when we're selling. So we have a lot of people on this call that we've worked with before. Tactically, how do you get that out? So you developed your story. We're very much believers in having a core message. We're a communications firm. People ask us all the time, what do you is it social media? Is it just Insta, or do you do print mailing now, or this and that? The reality is you deploy your message across all platforms, but you have a key message. You have a key message again and again. And we have a methodology called 333. About 85% of people get all the message they're going to use to make a buying or decision or any decision in 3 seconds. Lord help us. It's a quick 2 to 7 words. It's your bold statement. It's emotionally rooted. That is your main message, and it's on everything. Your next message is your 30-second, 333. About 10% of people will give you 30 seconds to understand something that's important. So again, oh my gosh, that's not very much time. So you've got your main message, and it's 2 bullet points. If you're trying, this is targeted to your specific community. So if there is a building project and your target audience is senior citizens, 3 second message, what are the 2 bullet points which connect with the senior citizens in the Swiss Miss way? What is it going to give them? What is it going to support them? 333, the last three is 3 minutes. About 5% of people will give you 3 minutes to understand a complicated topic. Again, Lord help us. But that's the way it is. So you never lead with your 3 minute message. You don't lead with pie charts and detailed information. All that stuff's important, but you park it on your website. You park it somewhere else. Your hook is the 3 second message, 30 seconds, and the story. Your hook is the emotional story, which gets somebody connected enough that now they are going to invest. And this is kind of a downer of a story, but we did the anti-human trafficking campaign years ago, probably about 8 years ago now, for the state of Ohio. And when we got that campaign, people know what human trafficking is now. not too long ago, they didn't know what it was. Is that immigration? Is it the sex trade? What is it? We did all the research, met with all the people, and we found out that the most repugnant aspect is the sex trade. And the 3 second message is no one should be sold for sex. And it's gross and it's in your face and it's emotional. We got your attention now, man. Now we can now talk about people that have had been victims. We can talk about immigration. We can talk about other things, but it's that connection that is so important, right? So that's where we're going here. Is the idea the story is very much the connection. Phil, do you want to elaborate a little more about just the need to deploy on many different mediums?
Sure. So, as Tom talks about, we have the primary message, 3 second message, a 30-second message that goes into more detail, the 3 minute message, and such a small percentage that will actually engage. As he said, stories are a way to keep people engaged, to go deeper into your message. But if you know your primary messages that you want to communicate, those messages can not be just shared in one place, one time, and we expect that people will get it. Especially with the way people consume information today. People consume information on the platforms that they find most convenient, they like the best, from the people that they find most convenient and they like the best. Which means that if we have primary messages or stories that we want to tell, we can't just tell them in one place. We have to be telling them in our speaking engagements. We have to be telling them on our website. We have to be telling them on our social media. We have to be telling them in our print materials, and then we have to help others help tell those stories. And so those same stories have to be packaged in different ways so that we can tell the same story that is delivering our primary messages across many different platforms and tell it more than once. You might think, I'm so sick of telling this story. I've told this story so many times. When you begin hearing other people tell your same story back to you, that drives home a point, now you know you're just starting to make a connection. You're just starting for that to spread. Those powerful stories that are good examples, you will be telling them so many times in so many different ways that you will be sick of them, but that just means that they're beginning to spread throughout your community or with those that you serve, or with your stakeholders. And so, again, we would really, really encourage you not only to think about the story, but also think about your primary messages that you want to reinforce through the story, and then how are you deploying that consistently across many different platforms. Tom, before we conclude with our summary, anything else you want to add on here?
Just an utterly shameless plug. We're the Impact Group, and we help organizations package their stories and get them out. So we'd be honored to help. Any strategic planning you would have, we would be honored to do that. We do an awful lot of that, and also a lot of work with a positive culture development. As we said before, those three elements: communication, positive culture, strategic plan. When those three things come together, you have a high impact organization. It's what we do.
Again, as we conclude, we would really encourage you to think about anything that you're trying to communicate. Challenge yourself to find a human story in that. In finding the story, make sure that you are consciously portraying those that you serve as the heroes in that story, with yourselves as leaders or the leaders in your organizations being the guide, or the organization itself being the guide that helps them along that journey and helps them find success. That's what will resonate with your stakeholders. And then lastly, remember the power in concise messaging repeated over multiple platforms over and over and over. Again, we really appreciate everyone taking their time. We have about 1 minute left if anyone wants to throw a question in the chat. Otherwise, we hope you come back to a future webinar. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you, everybody. So appreciate your time. Have a great day.